Okay, I think we're good, so I think we can kick off now. So, thank you very much. Oh, hang on, I need to stay close to this. Thank you very much for coming in today to talk about reinventing operations transformation. I've got my clicker here, so I need to remember to use that. So, before we begin, I want you all to take a moment to imagine your worst day at work. Okay, you've done something really stupid. You've got that really horrible sinking feeling in your stomach. You can't believe what you just did, right? You're embarrassed to tell your colleagues, and you're dreading telling your boss. Okay, so think about that for a moment. Now, is anyone imagining that they've lost money for their organization? Hold your hands up if you're thinking whatever you've done has lost some money for your organization. So at the back, that's a very strong hand there. Okay, so there's a few of us, right? It happens, it's a bit embarrassing. Is anyone imagining they've lost $900 million or nearly $1 billion? Anyone? No? Okay, that's good. Otherwise, this is going to get really painful really quickly. Okay, but scarily enough, that is exactly what happened in August 2020, right? In a large financial institution, not JP Morgan, I want to make absolutely clear, somebody was doing a wire transfer, or trying to do a wire transfer for $8 million, and accidentally transferred $900 million, okay? That is a really, really bad day at work, right? That sinking feeling, that's pretty awful in this situation. So how on earth can something like this happen? Well, to quote Forbes, this happened because the software was so bad that it almost encouraged bank personnel to make huge mistakes, okay? So think about that for a second. That's $1 billion usability issue, okay? The first one I've seen, hopefully the last I'll ever see. But this is exactly the space where my team is working. So my name's Matt Phillips, I'm Design Director at Markets Operations at JP Morgan. And my small team of designers is focused on designing software to eliminate the risk of mistakes like this, and also to drive efficiency within the operations space. So let's talk a little bit about operations. Most people don't know what operations is, certainly don't know what markets operations is. Now, can I move that? Oh, that's better. I can stand back now. Okay, so basically, markets operations supports the trading desks at JP Morgan. So all the trades that get done at JP Morgan need to be processed, okay? And that's the responsibility of the markets operations team. At a very high level, and this is a generalized diagram to explain what's going on. So basically, a trade is executed in the front office. Now, the front office is that bit you'll see on TV and all the films extra, where like lots of screens, people walking around dynamically, shouting at each other, all that sort of thing, right? That's the front office. That's where the trades get executed. Once that's happened, those trades then to be processed. Now, this is very much a generalized diagram. It's not specific to JP Morgan. This is kind of across the industry. There are variants between different asset classes. But at a very high level, what's happening is that trade is first confirmed. So there's a legal agreement between the different parties. There's then the settlements process, which is the exchange of money and goods, so transferring the shares of whatever financial instrument and transferring money back. There's then a post-settlement process, which is essentially reconciliation, which is making sure that's all happened correctly. And then there's a reporting aspect, which is ensuring everyone knows exactly what's going on. Now, the vast majority of that is automated. So we have some huge machines, some huge complex systems that automate that process. And that automation is what's called STP, or straight-through processing. Now, across the industry, STP rates are probably somewhere between 90 and 99.9%, right? It varies between organizations and it varies between asset classes. But when things, what's called fall out of STP, or we can't process them automatically, they get handed down to an operations team. And those operations teams then need to manually process those transactions. And effectively what that means is them logging into different pieces of software, maybe reaching out to clients, updating different data points to manually complete that trade. This is where my team is working, focused on redesigning those tools that the operations teams are actually using. So why operations? Why is it interesting working in operations? Well, to be honest, when I first started working in this space, I thought it was a bit of a backwater, right? I wasn't particularly excited about it. I've been doing this amazingly for about 25 years. I've worked in lots of different organizations and lots of different projects. I've been working on front office trading tools, which is pretty exciting, really, really cool stuff. And then I was working in operations, and I was like, okay, is this really right? But it transpires it's one of the most interesting and exciting places I've worked as a designer. So what is it? What changed my perspective of working in the operations space? Well, firstly, they get it. They understand us as designers. And more specifically, what I mean by that is operations is entirely process-driven. So operations is all about processing. Now, that can be updating payment informations, manually cancelling and rebooking a trade, or maybe netting different trades together. Now, these processes, and there are hundreds of them across the organization, they need to be executed hundreds, if not thousands of times, well, hundreds of times a day at least. And it's really important they are done accurately without mistake. To make sure they're done accurately, we standardize them. And those standardized processes go into what's called hang on, I have to remember what we got. Standard operating procedure documents, okay? Which is basically a document that explains all the steps in that process, right? As I'm talking through these standard operating procedures, maybe some of you are starting to think, hang on, that sounds kind of familiar, right? And it is. Standard operating procedures are very, very similar to user journeys, okay? And why this is really important is it means that operations teams and designers see the world through the same lens, which makes collaborating and working with these teams much easier than any other space I've ever worked in. The other thing that's really exciting about working in operations is complexity. So as designers, I think most of us are problem solvers. Most of us got into this space because we really enjoy solving problems. The more complex the problem we're trying to solve, the happier we generally are. Operations has some really complex problems for us to solve, particularly in financial services. We're designing user journeys that very often, or in fact always, span multiple pieces of software. They have multiple users and hundreds of data points that it's absolutely critical the designers need to understand. So if you're interested in solving really complex problems, operations is a great place to be. The other thing about these processes or these user journeys is they need to be executed at really high speed with high degrees of accuracy. Because the faster you can do a process, the more efficient it is, the less it costs an organization. So again, designing these things are really, really knotty problems for us to work on as designers. And that's another reason why I really enjoy working in this space. Sorry, I'm going to have a drink. This is hard work. Okay. So it's great that I like working there. It's great that my team love working there. But what do we bring into the party, right? I said at the outset that we were reinventing transformation. That's a pretty bold statement, right? Why do I see that? Why do I say that? Well, historically, what happens in transformation programs is a technology team will engage with the users, with operations. They'll spend some time asking them what it is they want. They will record that into a business requirements document. They will then go away and build it. They'll come back, and I don't think it's a surprise to anyone in this room what happens next. The users turn around and go, that's not what we expected. That's not what we wanted. Okay? There's then a conversation about how it get delivered in phase 2. Phase 2's never been planned, it's never been budgeted for. Phase 2 very often gets cancelled. And what that means is you get an operations team who are left with some software that really doesn't meet their needs. You also have a technology team who are incredibly frustrated because despite their best efforts, they have some really dissatisfied customers. So ultimately, at the end of the day, everyone feels dissatisfied with this. Now, the obvious thing that happens here is as designers, we go in and we prototype and we test things and we build confidence in a solution by that. But there is something else that happened here. I think as we talked through this process, one thing that I realized is that the focus was on building applications. Our technology team were building applications. They weren't thinking about processes anymore, which is really at the heart of what operations teams do. So the transformation or the reinvention that we brought is we changed the program from being focused on software delivery through to be focused on process re-engineering. And that has had a really significant impact on the program and has amplified how we can potentially transform the impact of this transformation. So how did we do that? Did we go along and go, hey, design's here, it's all good, stand aside, we'll fix it? No, funnily enough, we didn't do that, because that doesn't go down very well, as I've discovered. What we did, which is what we all do as designers every single day, and it is our core skill, and we very often forget about it, we drew it. We basically drew what these processes look like. We articulated what it was going to be like at the moment, what it was at the moment, and how it was going to look in the future. Someone far smarter than me once said to me, the role of the designer is to make the intangible tangible, to take those things that people have got in their heads and actually draw them out so people can actually see them and look at them and start to have really concrete discussions around them. Now, the way we did that was we developed this very simple storyboarding process, which is not coming out particularly great on the screen here, but basically, this allowed us to show people what the process looked like at the moment and potentially what it would look like in the future. And by having this way of visualizing it, it allowed all the teams involved to suddenly realize that it wasn't going to be enough just to redesign the applications, that maybe we're only making up 1 or 2 steps in this end-to-end process. That if we really wanted to be truly transformational, we were going to need to re-engineer this process from the ground up. And that's what we set about doing. Capturing these storyboards was not straightforward. There's a huge amount of complexity in them. And for a designer coming in fresh to this space, this was really, really tough. If you're working in operations, you might understand it, but that's like 10 years worth of experience. So how did we figure, what was the approach we took to allow our designers to quickly capture these processes and then articulate them back? Well, I think we got a bit lucky, to be honest with you. We were in the middle of lockdown, so we couldn't do face-to-face interviews. So we ended up doing video interviews. And these actually proved really, really powerful because what we were able to do was ask a user to walk us through their process and share their screen and video that whole thing. Now, what it allowed us to do was cover a lot of ground very quickly. We could cover a process in about a 30-minute interview and then maybe another 30-minute interview to confirm it afterwards. But that allowed us, our first phase of this, we covered about 120, 130 different processes. We covered a huge amount of ground really quickly, and we are a very small team. It also meant that we could capture every detail, not just what the user was saying to us, but every application, every screen, every data point, and all this information was absolutely critical when we came to the analysis process later on. The other thing, and it may be a small thing, but it was really important to us, is like, when you're working in a large organization, you can't pick and choose the software you use. We basically used Zoom for our interviews, and we used QuickTime to record them. Okay, it was really, really simple. Now, there are some tools out there that you can put on people's machines, and they will analyze their behavior on the machine and put those processes together for you. But what we realized with that is it's great, it will show you the process, but it won't give you the why. It won't tell you why people are doing the particular behaviors. And those are the things that are absolutely critical for you to understand if you want to redesign this process. So as I say, Zoom and QuickTime, super simple, super easy. So obviously there are other applications available. I'm not sponsored by Zoom or QuickTime. So from those processes, we created storyboards like this. And this was, I love doing this. This is like your sort of moment as a detective. You can't watch it through and understand it in one go. There's far too much information going on. Like these users, because they do these processes hundreds of times a day, it's very different to a consumer process. It's nearly fully automated for them. They literally flick between screens, they pull up different applications, they'll dive into this file or dive out that file. You can't keep up as you've taken them through it, right? It's happening really, really fast. There are loads of questions. There's loads of things they don't tell us, and there's loads of questions that, frankly, we don't know we need to ask as we're going through it, which is why the videos were so powerful, because we could literally go back and forth, rewind the video, go back, trying to piece together, okay, they're saying this, what are they referring to? Looking at the data that was on the screen, trying to figure out what was going on. If you work in complex applications, you know that data tells a story. And this was the story that we were able to piece together by going through these videos. For me, it was a bit like being a detective. It's kind of like my Sherlock Holmes moment, because you're trying to piece together a story from all these different pieces. And it's amazing how the user will be telling you something that's actually referring to something 2 screens back or in a different application altogether. So this was really powerful because it allowed us to do all that analysis without having to go back to the users. To give you a little bit of example of what we captured all the way through. So for each one of these steps, we captured who was doing it, what they were doing, the application, a screenshot, which we found was great because it just gives a representation, and then a brief description and some metrics, which I'll come back to later. So the example we're looking at here is, I don't know what you call them in the US. In the UK, we call it a green screen application. Is that the right terminology? But basically, there's still a few of these around, and they actually represent a real problem for us because users love them. These are absolutely, they're difficult to use to begin with, but once they start using them, they are so fast that it's really hard to take them off it. And we have a challenge is that we can't build applications that will run as quickly as these do. It's just simply not technically feasible. So it's an interesting challenge for us to try and rise to try and figure out how do we simplify it so we can actually build something that is better than these here. I'll give you a quick overview of this process. Now, I've genericized the process. I can't share any specific ones from the work we're doing at the moment. But at a very high level, what's going on here is we have a break in the process. We need to reach out to a client to confirm some information. Now, that might be because the client has requested we do that, or it might be because there is a data point missing. So effectively, the user will log into a system. They'll identify a piece of work they need to do. They'll then go into a number of other systems to pull together the data they want. They will put that into an email, send that over to the client. The client will respond. That's assuming the client does respond and we don't have to keep chasing them. The client will respond. Someone in the operations team will look at that response, determine what the next action should be. They will then go into a system of record and update something in there. They will then need to take that email and put it into an archiving system because we always need to keep an audit record of everything that's going on. That's the maker part of the process. There's also a checker part of the process that happens afterwards, where anytime there's a manual interaction, we need to have someone go in and check it afterwards. So someone else will log into the same system, they will check the right actions have been taken, and then once that's approved, they will click approve, and then they will move on. So it's a fairly simple process, but there's a lot of moving parts, and there tend to be a lot of different applications involved in it. Where we found these drawings really powerful was the fact that for the first time our technology teams could see that the application that they were building was only a small step in a much larger process which they had no visibility of. So they had no opportunity to really figure out how they could incorporate more of that process into their applications. For our senior managers who are really time poor, it was one of the first times they really saw the complexity of the challenge that their teams were facing and why these things were so difficult to resolve. So bringing these, basically by drawing it, we established a shared understanding that allowed the whole team, the whole team being technology, data science, operations, and design, all to collaborate much more effectively. We found this storyboarding format so useful, we actually use it all the way through our design process now, all the way from concept through for high fidelity designs. We find it's a really great structured way of working. It reminds us of all the questions we need to ask and answer as we go through the design process, and it keeps us rooted in that user journey, which very often as you get into the detailed screen design, you can lose sight of the bigger picture of what you're trying to build. Now, I'm probably not the only one who has to prove the value of the design team. So why are we here as designers? What are we trying to prove? To be able to demonstrate impact, we need to be able to measure something. And we needed to be able to benchmark these current processes. So when we build new solutions, we can measure back against those benchmarks and identify the impact ultimately we've had as the design team. However, the reality is, because we are working with legacy systems, and I'm sure many people are in a similar boat, these systems don't capture measurements. They don't have any data associated with them. So we were really starting from scratch when we thought about how do we go about capturing data. We had to define the metrics we wanted to gather. So the core things we were focused on was efficiency and the risk of mistakes. So when we thought about efficiency, we started off by capturing the active time a user was working on a process. Now, we looked at time and motion studies, but we actually realized it was far more efficient or far more accurate to ask people to estimate how long they thought a process was taking. We were then able to combine that with frequency data to be able to give a cost for an individual process to the organization. And it's amazing how quickly that adds up. So if you have a process that takes 5 minutes and is executed 100 times a day, that's actually 8 hours and 20 minutes worth of work, which is actually quite staggering when you think about it. So very quickly, these things grow. And what we realize is if we can show that we've reduced half the time a process takes, or maybe reduced it down to 10% its original time, we can start to demonstrate very, very clear impact. To try and understand the drivers of that efficiency, we captured things like teams, users, handoffs, applications, screens. We even captured clicks, which is probably not very popular, and I know it's not a good representation of usability. But when you're looking at a process that's executed hundreds of times a day, actually gathering clicks and being able to reduce the number of clicks makes a significant difference to the end user. We talk about risk, the risk of user making a mistake. And to understand that, we created a measure called manual process gaps. Sorry, quick drink of water. Now, this was basically where users were either manually entering data, copying and pasting data between systems, or making a decision based on the information they were reviewing. These were opportunities for human error in that process. By capturing the number of manual process gaps and then actively working them to eliminate them from the process, we could reduce the risk of human error within this end-to-end process. And reduction of risk was our second priority, next to driving efficiency. We found this data really powerful because historically what we'd done is we approached every process with the same level of enthusiasm or the same effort. But what we realized was not everything was equal. There were processes that had a greater cost to the organization or processes that represented a greater risk. And that's where we should be focusing our effort rather than splitting our effort equally across every single process we were working on. The other thing we realized with this was, and it was a side effect of manually counting all this stuff, we realized that actually we could do the same count as we went through the design process. So we could actually start to look at new solutions that we were designing and benchmark them against the old solution and figure out, were we going in the right direction? How much better was one proposed design versus another one? The other thing it allowed us to do is to have much more intelligent conversations with technology teams. Now, I think we've all been in that boat where we've designed an awesome solution, we take it to technology, they take one look at it and go, no, can't do it, we're going to do this instead. And you kind of hold your hands up in horror and you're like, oh my God, what's going on here, right? But then you end up in this awful opinion-based discussion around, no, this is a better solution, that's a better solution, and it's really difficult to get out of. Using something like this, we can actually start to articulate the benefits of one solution versus another. So we can then weigh up the cost versus benefits of maybe building that full solution, maybe as opposed to designing or building that cut-down solution, which makes the conversations with technology much more productive and much easier to resolve effectively. And also we can pass on to our stakeholders. We say, look, before we even get to build, we can say, look, this is the potential impact of this solution. Should we build this? Before, otherwise, we're just building it and we're going, well, we think it's going to be good, but we're not 100% sure. So it's about providing a little bit more clarity as we go through the design process. So we've now established a really good shared understanding of the problem that we want to solve. We know the different software, we know the inefficiencies, we know where the risk points are. So how do we go about tackling re-engineering a process? So we ask ourselves 3 questions. So the first question is, can we eliminate it? Then we ask ourselves if we're going to automate it, and if we can't automate it, how do we go about optimizing it? We think about elimination, that is getting rid of this process completely. So we would look at what is the root cause that's driving this process to be necessary. Can we move upstream in the organization to identify what that root cause is and eliminate it completely? And removing that process, which is a little bit of an odd thing for a design team because we're basically eliminating the thing we're about to design. But ultimately, if we take a step back, We are not there to design things. We are there to resolve business problems. And ultimately, that is the most efficient way to resolve the business problem. The next thing we look at is whether we can automate it. And obviously, I think in the world, the current climate, AI is a really big part of that. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. If we can't automate it, we then look at how do we optimize this process. So how do we make it as efficient for an ops user to work their way through that process? And how do we eliminate as many risks and mistakes as possible? And that's really where we get into much more traditional sort of screen design, application design type activities. The reality is we tend to end up halfway between automate and optimize most of the time. And I'll explain what I mean by this. So that process we talked about earlier, I do apologize, these are not showing up particularly well on the screen here, but basically this is how that process could be automated that we talked about earlier. So you could automatically send that email out to a client. The client responds. You could read that email, you could determine what the next action should be, and then you could automate updating any systems, etc. Right? It's on the surface, it's fairly straightforward. However, there is a huge amount of technology or tech requirements behind this. And what we've seen is the reality is to achieve something like this will involve multiple iterations of the solution. And what we've seen is transformation is not a flick of a switch. It's not like we suddenly go, we design it and we go, yep, transforms, switch it on, everything's great. It happens in a number of stages, and those stages can be from months to years in some instances. So what we find ourselves doing is actually mapping that journey from where we are at the moment, down at the bottom, to where we want to be in the future. And the reason this is important is that technology will do this. So technology will put together a tech roadmap, and they'll figure out the most logical order to build all the different, technical solutions that are required. But that doesn't actually take into account what the impact is going to be on the operations teams. And it doesn't take into account whether we are delivering incremental efficiency as we move towards our target state. So by doing something like this, we can say that, this is our current process at the bottom. First thing is we're going to automate sending out those emails. We're going to get a benefit from doing that. Then we're going to automate the next best action. We're going to leave that bit in the middle where we need to read the email coming back from the client, figure out what they want. That's a really tough problem to solve, and we'll do that last. And that'll be through a number of different stages we'll do that. But again, it changes the dynamic of the conversation. So it's not focused around the tech delivery. It's much more focused around how are we transforming operations and what are the different phases of that. I'm going to talk a little bit about AI and automation, as that's the theme of the conference. I should definitely include something around this. So AI is nothing new to JP Morgan. They've been doing it for 10 plus years. That said, the space I'm working in, it is fairly new. And I personally and my team, we're very much at the beginning of our journey of starting to integrate AI into the solutions we're building. I want to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we are learning as we go through that. Now, for some people in the room, that might be a little bit basic, but for other people who are maybe on a similar journey to us, there may be some little nuggets in there that can save you banging your head against the wall in the same way that we have. So the first thing I want to talk about is focus, right? In today's climate, we're all talking about AI, right? Everything's going to be AI. So there's a sort of like an instinct that says, we'll just take the whole process and we'll apply AI to it. But what we're seeing is that's not necessarily the best approach. That actually it makes more sense to break it into a number of different elements, which we have done with this process, some of which are much more suitable for the application of AI, and some of which are not. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, that reading of the client responses when they come back, that is a perfect application of artificial intelligence. And the reason for that is because it's unstructured data. Now, we've tried lots of different ways to get clients to respond to us in a particular format, but they don't. And understandably, they're working really hard, they're really busy. They'll just reply, they'll put a Y in an email back to us rather than write yes, or they'll just put a number in. So it's very difficult for traditional automation process to be able to interpret that. And I think the other thing I should mention is that when we send emails out to clients to request information, we don't just request a single piece of information. We'll put it like 10, 20, 30 questions into a single email, which is very complicated for traditional automation to be able to understand. So that space, AI, great solution. Sending out the emails, on the other hand, well, that's really just a matter of pulling data from different data sources via API, constructing an email and sending it out to a client. That's much more suitable for rules-based automation. There's no intelligence required there. So for that reason, we probably wouldn't use AI in that space. The other reason we maybe not use AI in that space is around control. And what I mean by control is controlling the risk of an AI making a mistake. So if you're working in the consumer space and you have an AI solution that sends an email to the wrong customer, it's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world, right? In financial services, we can't do that. It can't happen. So that's what we talk about control. For that reason, where we have AI making recommendations and stuff, we always have a human checker to check before the final decision is made. Now, at some point in the future, that human checker may not be required. Personally, I can't see that happening anytime soon. I'm not even sure if it ever will do. But what that means is so there's a couple of things here. So first of all, we're not automating with AI, we're actually augmenting the human user. So the human user, basically the AI is reading the email that comes back, classifying what it's about, trying to figure out what the next best action is, but then we pass that over to a human to make the final decision, right? So we're making sure that actually, yeah, we're not going to make a mistake with anything like this. Now, if you think about that with the sending out the emails to begin with, if you need a human being to check that, that's adding an additional step which you wouldn't need with more traditional automation. So actually, you end up with a process that is even less efficient than you'd started off with. So again, that's another thing that we're kind of figuring out as we're going through this process. The final thing to talk about is feedback. And I think this is probably the bit that impacts us as designers most of all. So effectively, you train your AI model that drives all these things. Once that model has been trained, we'll start to use that in production. But the training process needs to continue. To increase the accuracy, but also to ensure the accuracy doesn't degrade over time. Now, to be able to train a model, you need to be able to feedback to it. You need to be able to say, yes, that's the right thing, no, or yes, that's the right recommendation, no, that's not the right recommendation, and then point it in the direction of the right thing. Feedback can be done in one of two ways. You can either do it explicitly or implicitly. Explicitly means that a user is actively going to the model and saying, okay, yes, that is the right thing you've done, or actually, no, that's not the right thing you do, this is the right thing you should do. The problem with doing that is it puts the burden on the user. So it adds additional work to that user, having to inform the model about what it should or shouldn't be doing. And it also is a weird thing from a user's perspective. You're thinking there going, hang on, like, surely AI is supposed to make my life easier, and it seems to be doing extra work here. So what we try and do is we try and avoid that. What we try and do is we use implicit feedback, which is whereby we use the user's behavior to inform whether the model has it right or wrong. So basically, the user will either, I'm trying to think of a great example now. But basically, it's like trying to design it in such a way that the user's behavior can be implied and then used to educate the model. Now, that is not easy. And again, I think that's a real challenge for us as designers as we go through this process, trying to figure out how do we do that in a seamless way so that the users don't feel that they're doing all the heavy lifting for our AI solutions. As I say, we are very much at the beginning of our journey with this. I would imagine in a year's time, we'll probably be talking about very, very different things. But this is kind of like, this is where we're at the moment. The final thing I wanted to just quickly talk about was around innovation. So the really nice thing about writing talks like this is it forces you to reflect on the work that you are doing as a designer. Very often we'll be doing things and some things will work and some things won't. And you'll go, oh, I'm going to do that again, and I'm not going to do that again. But trying to figure out, well, why did this work? Why was that effective versus that? You rarely have time to do it. And I found actually writing this presentation has really helped me to articulate why my team has been successful, where maybe other teams have really struggled. And I think the first thing that came out was that pivot from being application focused to being focused around process re-engineering. The other thing that I think is really interesting and is in relation to particularly the application of AI. And I'm going to lean on this, which is a model that was put together by MIT, the Sloan School of Management at MIT, there's a reference at the bottom there, so it's Murray and Bidden who put this together. Effectively, this is a framework for how they think about innovation. And they have a concept of what they call little I and big I innovation. So little I innovation is all about incremental change, incremental improvement, like BAU type stuff. Big I innovation is those massive leaps forward, right? Now, little I innovation focuses on well understood problems using well understood technology. Big I innovation is really using new and novel technology to tackle very ill-defined problems. I think AI sits very closely in this new, novel technology space. But what I'm seeing, and through conversations with other people, is that we are applying it to well-understood problems. And I think the role of the designer is really at this point here to help articulate those really ill-defined problems in a way that our data science teams and the teams working with AI can understand. And it's through bringing those two disciplines together that we have an opportunity to reach and start driving this big I innovation. So those are the things I wanted to talk about today. I'm going to open for questions now. I think hopefully we'll have some questions online as well. If you don't have any questions, I've got some questions for you as well. So I'll put these up. You can either ask a question or you can answer one of these questions here. So the questions I've got here is, how is AI changing what you design? I think there's an awful lot of conversation about how the tools we use as designers will change as a result of AI. And I think there's a lot less conversation about what we will design as designers with AI is interesting. A challenge I have at work is I get pushback from stakeholders, and when they say, well, when we're automating everything with AI, why should we invest in design? Which is a really challenging question. And then the final one is, how does design drive successful AI solutions? So if anyone wants to have a crack at those, please do. Otherwise, we'll open to some general questions. So I think there might be a microphone floating around. Oh, got some. Okay, questions are good.
When you're talking about designing process change, I just wonder how much maybe do you underestimate or take into account the change management that's necessary for process innovation and putting out a new process? Because a lot of time that can be a major hurdle.
It's massive. It's absolutely massive. And I think it can be the difference between success and failure. You've got to take your teams on that journey. And I think that's another benefit of engaging with the design team, is that they are engaged with the users and bringing them on that journey. But you know, change management, unless you do that, you are really limiting your ability to have success. So I 100% agree with that.
At the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that clicks aren't a good yeah. source of usability. Why would that be?
I think it's a good challenge. So I think I'm probably going back in my mind like 15 years, when I think in consumer-facing stuff, very often it's about making things clearer rather than reducing the number of clicks. I think people kind of like, and this is going back a while now, people really focused on reducing clicks, which you can reduce the number of clicks, but if people don't know, if the journey's not clear, particularly in a consumer space, it doesn't really mean you're getting a better solution. I think that's what I was getting, and I was probably, you know, harking back to like 15 years ago when I was told not to look at clicks. Question down the front here.
Thanks so much. I also had a question about your metrics. It was really interesting to see kind of the total cost with frequency and time calculations. And I was wondering if you felt like there were any blind spots or data that you wish you could have gathered to help kind of clarify the impact of the journey you were documenting.
I think we are constantly refining our approach. I think, you know, as I said before, this is it's really basic, right? It works, but I wish it was more sophisticated, so we're constantly refining it. I think the one thing we did start gathering, which is really interesting, is we started gathering attitudinal data in all these processes. So we would ask people to rank on a scale of 1 to 5, like how good, how efficient they thought the process are, how much it reduced the risk, etc. But what we saw is everything came out slap bang in the middle. And we realized that people become blind to these things because they're doing it so frequently. And there wasn't really a benchmark for them to compare it against. Like, all the processes were similarly a little bit naff, to be honest. So I think that's one area where I think we tried it and we moved away from it. I think the thing we want to do is we want to get more rigorous in the way that we capture this data. And also, I think, importantly, figuring out the most appropriate way to share it with stakeholders as well. So I think those are kind of a couple of areas that we're doing. I think the other thing that's interesting is that there's some really basic stuff. Like, we talked about, we realized that as a team, we weren't 100% aligned on what all these metrics meant. And it took us about 6 months to realize that. And so we've been going through this refinement process of making sure we document exactly what each one of these metrics means, making sure everyone's on the same page, and then reflecting, like, 6 months, a year later, go, is this giving us what we want? Is there more things to learn from it? So it's a continually evolutionary process.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for the presentation. This was awesome. I also work in finance or financial reporting as well, so it's really interesting to hear your perspectives on AI here. I think what I was curious about is you said you had like two calls or 2 video calls about the operations that you did. One thing that I find is that, like, depending on who I talk to, the operation can be a little bit different. If I talk to, like, internal solution architects, they might do things a certain way because that's the tools that are available. When I'll talk to customers, maybe they'll do things a different way, and they'll want to do things a different way because of what they have available in other software or otherwise. So I'm wondering, like, kind of where did your confidence come from with those 2 calls? And is that always your rule of thumb for operations management, or?
No, I think, so there's a couple of things going on there. So I think what we realized, if we spoke to team leads, they would tell us how the process should be done, not necessarily how it was done. So that was a learning for us. We saw individual users, there is definitely some variance between users. And I think what we tried to focus on is where there was, I suppose, intentional variance. So we saw variance between different regional teams. And very often there was a requirement for those. There was a fundamental driver of why those differences were there. So we tried to focus on those. Again, I don't think we would ever be at the point where we have captured everything 100%. And I think it's that balance, that trade-off that we're trying to figure out where that right point is. Where have we got enough information to move forward versus we've captured every single nuance and every single detail. To your point about 2 calls, I think we try and keep it to 2 calls. What we find is that these people have day jobs. They don't want to be spending time with us. So we try and keep it to 2 calls. Sometimes it can take longer. Some processes can be a lot more complicated, particularly if there are multiple users involved and things like that. So, 2 is what we try and target. It can go on longer than that sometimes.
Thank you.
And sorry, I'm just going to cut in with a question from the virtual chat real quick. The question is, how do you balance between human error versus AI error?
How do we balance between human error and AI error? So, it's a great question. I think we think about them very, very differently. So, human error, human error, what we try and do is we put checks and balances. So we have like make a checker process where there's a risk of human error. I think we probably do the same thing where we have AI as well. So we always have, like, the AI may be acting as the maker, but we would always have a checker after that. And it also depends on the process. So some processes may be more business critical than others. So it's not like every process has to have the same level of control around it.
So I just had a quick question about how do you make decisions using AI based off of like a POC, so like a proof of concept, where it's not something that's fully built into the technology, or do you base those decisions on taking the time to fully integrate it so that you can have a more accurate, data benchmark?
I mean, this is very much something that we're looking at the moment. So I think what we're seeing is that, and again, I'm sort of generalizing here, but I think it's only once you've got something, but you've got to get something into production to be able to start really, really training it. And the more data you can put through a model, the more accurate it will become, the quicker. So it's a real balance. Like, we train our models in like an MVP type scenario, and then we really want them to get them into production quite quickly. But we don't, it's not like we flick a switch and it's suddenly on. It's a very measured approach. It's a very controlled approach.
So I guess based on that, sorry, second part of the question, what MVP would you recommend implementing that to? Like one that is like basically ready for development, or one that is kind of still in the ideation stages that you could still make changes to?
I think it's going to depend on your data science team, to be honest. Because I think it really depends on, like, how quickly can your data science team build a model and train that model? Because if they can do that really, really quickly, then you can do things fairly quickly, like you very much when you're in the concept stage. But if they can't do that, if there's a lot more work that's involved, and this is, completely external to the work we're doing, just as a general comment, I think if they can do it quickly, then you can test it quickly. But sometimes these models can take some time to actually develop, and in that case, you're probably not going to be able to iterate massively with how you're using that model.
Cool, thank you.
Hello, just for context, I work in higher education, and so resource-wise, you're kind of strapped, and it's also a system that has been around for a very long time. So processes have been there, and they've been added to, and not always in the best way.
Yep.
And when you are, I go from project to project working with different units on the campus. And a lot of the times I'll run into groups that a lot of their processes are really not great, but there's also a time crunch and personnel crunch. So how do you determine which processes to address and which to leave and iterate on in the future?
So I think we'd think about it from the perspective of what is the impact of that process. So, if you've got a process that is done once a year, it's awful, but it's once a year. It's probably not the end of the world, unless there's like the outcome of that is particularly critical. If you've got a process that a number of people are doing fairly regularly, that maybe should be your focus. But I think the other interesting thing you point there is, I think, we are resource strapped as well. And I think what we're trying to do is, when we think about these processes and we break them down as this, we're trying to think about them as discrete modules within them. So we can design something once and then reuse it in as many places as possible. And I think that's how we're thinking about it, to try and achieve that scale, because you can't go and redesign every single process. There's just far too many of them. So our kind of goal is that we design these discrete components that then effectively can be put together to create other processes in the future.
Okay, thank you. And if I just have time to answer one of your questions, if you so desire.
Yeah, please.
The second one about AI automating everything, why invest in design? At least from my position and where I work, there's a lot of different kinds of users, from both internal and external, coming from a variety of walks of life. And to that point of a variety of processes, you have to make sure that the design can function with the human going in and doing said process, as well as an AI setting it up. So if the AI sets up the process, or if the AI designs something, you gotta go back and make sure that a person can use it too.
Yes.
And it's not just a computer brain that's going through, because not everybody has that resource.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I pick on something else you mentioned earlier as well. I think it's really important, is the fact that, you talked about these processes have evolved over time and they've changed and they're not great. I think one of the things that I'm realizing is, when you design a process, you think that's it, it's going to be fixed. But actually it's not. There's always going to be changes in the future. So trying to think about building flexibility in the future, building these processes so they can evolve and change in the future without having to reinvent the wheel every single time, I think is really important.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I wanted to touch on something you said. You said during your process, you realized that you and your team were not aligned on what the KPIs were when you were going through these processes. As y'all were having those kinds of discussions, how did you navigate the pivot internally within your team and then kind of communicate that externally with your organization?
When you say the KPIs, you need the measurements we were capturing?
Yeah, sorry, measurements being captured.
That's a good question. I think we always try to be as transparent as possible. I think we are really driving, so from a design team, I think we're really kind of like a driving force behind those measures. So I think it's not so much, there's less of a kind of a clash between one set of KPIs here and another set of KPIs here. I think we're all fairly aligned on the KPIs from the outset. It's how do we measure against those KPIs that I think is changing. But I think the key is transparency. And I think actually it's a really good point. So that, you know, relationships are everything. Right? If you've got really good relationships with your partners, you can navigate that space really successfully. It's not too challenging. If you have difficult relationships, it makes everything difficult. That's my personal perspective, at least.
Thank you.
From a software development standpoint, I'm just thinking about when you're redesigning the processes for a complex trading floor and so forth, there must be various software vendors in there. And
Yeah.
I'm curious about the frustrations that you must hit, because I think that you must have to scale back some of your plans just because other software vendors aren't willing to allow the AIs, or I mean the APIs or whatever, to be integrated in many cases.
I think 100%. And actually, that is the space where the design team spend a lot of their time, is like, we would kind of define where we want to get to, even if it's an optimized process. And to your point, there are always vendor solutions or solutions we have no control over. And so it's that negotiation about, okay, well, we can't get an API from this one, so what is the alternative solution? How are we going to resolve that? So again, by mapping these out, it allows us to have really good conversations with technology and again, be very transparent about those individual problems we're trying to solve. But it is, you know, the reality is we can design a beautiful process, but actually turning that into reality, that's where all the hard work is. That's where all the back and forth and the iteration lies.
So you mentioned in the research phase of this project when you were conducting interviews that, and let me know if I got this right, that you had your numbers and your clicks and everything, but then you said you were getting some repetition, so you added in questions about like attitude.
Yes.
What type of insights did you gather from that? Because that's more of like obviously the qualitative side. So what's kind of the most valuable thing you got out of that question?
I think the thing we learned is that it didn't work. I think that it was really interesting because we felt it was really important to include this. And so, you know, we baked it into our process. We were doing these interviews, but everything was coming out at around the middle. It was really, and there wasn't really any value in that, in saying, well, this process is kind of okay. We were kind of hoping that would help us like drive our prioritization, that operations teams would say to us, look, this is really problematic. This is where you need to focus your energy. But what we saw was that just generally was not happening. So that's why we stopped doing that. But that said, you know, we are still, you know, as we launch new software and new features and new processes, we do gather attitudinal data off the back of it when we go out to users and understand how well things are working and stuff like that. So it's not that we've stopped doing it entirely, it's that we've stopped doing it at that part of the process.
Right, that makes sense. It's interesting how so much of the changes we make, and it's necessary, is to have those numbers, but sometimes the most important changes come from the qualitative insights.
Yeah.
I just thought that was cool that was included. You kind
Absolutely,
of have to piggyback them in
Yes.
on the numbers, even though they can be some of the most
Yeah.
important questions that you ask. That's
Absolutely.
interesting.
And actually linking back to that point about change management, that's fundamental to ensuring that people do have a positive sense about that experience. Because if you don't get the change management right, it's like, okay, you wake up in the morning and you're suddenly using a new piece of software and no one's told you it's going to happen, no one's trained you, and that has a huge impact on that attitudinal experience. So yeah, absolutely.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
And I think we have time for one last question.
I never expected so many questions. This is really hard work.
So you mentioned a few different metrics like, number of clicks, like impact to the system, maybe like time to do like the different processes. If you had to choose just like some top 3 or top 5 different metrics that like are super high priority for you when you like look at a given project, do you have like certain things that come to mind in terms of prioritization of different metrics?
I think there's 2. So the first one is the time it takes to complete a process. And when we multiply that by frequency, that gives us the cost. The other one is the number of applications involved. And that's critical. And the reason for that is there's a couple of things. So firstly, if you've got like 3 applications in a process, you're having to support, that means you're having to maintain from a technical perspective 3 separate applications. That's expensive for a business. The other thing is when a user is working across multiple applications, there's an increased chance that they're copying and pasting data between those applications, which means there's an increased risk of mistake. So I think the 2 I would focus on would be the time and the frequency and also the number of applications involved. Cool. I should actually mention something. I was supposed to mention right at the very beginning that all the opinions expressed here today are my own and not necessarily those of JP Morgan. So if you never see me again, you know what's happened. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today. Thank you. And I'm walking around with a big badge with speaker written on it, so if you've got any other questions, come and see me. Thank you.